August 7, 1942. Guadalcanal. The first wave of Marines splashing ashore expected to fight an enemy they could see, track, and kill using the tactics they'd drilled into muscle memory at Camp Pendleton. What they got instead was 3 months of dying to ghosts. Japanese snipers had transformed the jungle canopy into a 3-dimensional killing field where death arrived without warning, often without sound, and always from somewhere impossible to pinpoint. The Marines called it getting sniped. The Japanese called it necessary economy of force. By the time Henderson Field was finally secured and the island declared won in February 1943, Marine after-action reports had documented something that would haunt Pacific Theater commanders for the next 2.5 years. A single well-positioned sniper could inflict more casualties than an entire enemy rifle squad. More disturbingly, conventional counter-sniper doctrine, the kind written by serious men with staff college educations, wasn't working. The numbers told a grim story that got grimmer the longer you looked at it. On Bougainville in November 1943, the 3rd Marine Division recorded an average of 15 combat deaths per day attributed to sniper fire alone. That's not 15 casualties total, wounded and killed combined. That's 15 men killed outright, not wounded, dead. Because Japanese snipers using the Type 97 rifle with its 6.5mm round were trained to aim for the head and upper chest, the zones where a single hit meant lights out. The wound patterns were so consistent, so predictable, that Marine medical officers could identify sniper casualties before even examining the body. They'd see the stretcher coming, see the way the poncho draped over the form, and know. Another one. One shot, one kill wasn't just a sniper motto embroidered on some patch. It was a mathematical reality that turned every advance through jungle terrain into a morbid lottery where the price of bad luck was a bullet through the brainstem. The Japanese had perfected something the Marines had never encountered in training, never even imagined possible in the carefully controlled exercises at Quantico. Their snipers weren't hiding behind rocks or in foxholes where you could suppress them with machine gun fire, weren't occupying the obvious positions that American doctrine said to check. First they were 30, 40, sometimes 60 feet up, in coconut palms tied to the trunks with rope, covered in vegetation so carefully woven that they became invisible even when you were looking directly at them. Some had been in position for days before Marines even landed, supplied with rice balls and water, defecating into bags to avoid giving away their location through the one biological function that couldn't be controlled. They had fields of fire carefully plotted to cover trails, water sources, and command posts. And they had patience that bordered on the supernatural, a willingness to wait hours for a single, high-value shot that made American ideas about fire discipline look positively impulsive. At Cape Gloucester, in December 1943, a single sniper pinned down an entire rifle platoon, 43 men, for 7 solid hours. Every time someone moved, every time anyone so much as shifted position, a round would crack past their head or slam into the log they were hiding behind with that distinctive thwack that meant the shooter knew exactly where you were. The Marines fired thousands of rounds into the tree line, suppressive fire that turned the jungle into a sawdust factory. They called in mortar strikes that obliterated acres of vegetation. They even tried having a Sherman tank blast the suspected trees with its 75mm gun, high explosive rounds that should have pulverized anything organic within the blast radius. Nothing worked. The sniper would go silent for 20 minutes, let everyone think he was dead or had displaced to another position, then drop another Marine the moment someone stood up. When they finally killed him. Late that afternoon, a lucky machine gun burst that happened to saw through his perch and sent him tumbling 40 feet to the jungle floor. They found he'd only fired 18 rounds, but he'd killed 4 Marines and wounded 6 more. a 55% hit rate under combat conditions that would have impressed Olympic shooters. The psychological toll was worse than the body count, and the body count was already intolerable. Marines started developing what battalion surgeons began calling sniper neurosis, a constant, hunched posture, and the complete inability to move naturally because every instinct, every survival mechanism hardwired into the human brain screamed that standing upright meant death. Men who'd been fearless in the face of banzai charges, who'd held positions against overwhelming odds, became paralyzed by an enemy they couldn't see. Platoon leaders couldn't conduct normal tactical movements. You couldn't send runners between positions without accepting that you were probably sending them to die. You couldn't establish proper defensive perimeters because the act of moving between positions was suicide. You couldn't do anything that required vertical posture. Everything slowed to a crawl because one invisible man with a rifle had reduced your combat effectiveness to almost nothing, had transformed a rifle platoon into a collection of terrified individuals, each praying the next shot wouldn't have their name on it. And the worst part, the thing that made it truly unbearable, was that the Japanese knew exactly what they were doing. Their field manuals, the ones captured later at Saipan and translated by Marine intelligence, explicitly emphasized sniper operations as a force multiplier. They'd done the math, calculated that one skilled marksman properly positioned was worth 10 regular infantrymen in jungle terrain. The numbers backed it up. A rifle squad required food, water, ammunition, and constant resupply. A sniper needed 120 rounds, a week's worth of rice, and the patience to wait. The return on investment was staggering. By mid-1943, Marine Corps intelligence had accumulated a file 3 inches thick documenting Japanese sniper tactics, positions, and effectiveness. The analysts knew where snipers preferred to hide. They knew how long snipers would hold position. They knew the average engagement distances, the preferred target selection, the ammunition conservation protocols. What they didn't have, what nobody had despite all this knowledge, was a solution. Standard counter-sniper doctrine wasn't working. The enemy had too much concealment, too much patience, and the Americans had wasted too much ammunition on suppressive fire that suppressed nothing except morale. Something had to change. And it would, though nobody could have predicted it would come from a most unlikely source, not from West Point or Annapolis, not from some brilliant tactician who'd studied Clausewitz and Sun Tzu. The solution would come from a Nebraska carnival worker who'd spent his entire life understanding one simple, exploitable truth. People can't help shooting at things that look like targets. Sergeant William Eldridge wasn't supposed to be the guy who changed Marine Corps tactics and saved thousands of lives. He was supposed to be running the shooting gallery at the Nebraska State Fair, just like his father and grandfather before him, 3 generations of Eldridges watching people try to win stuffed animals by shooting metal ducks with .22 rifles that were deliberately miscalibrated. But Pearl Harbor had other plans for everyone, disrupted every normal trajectory, and in March 1942, Eldridge walked into a recruiting office in Lincoln with skills that seemed utterly worthless for modern warfare. 20 years of experience watching people shoot at moving ducks. 20 years of knowing exactly when they'd pull the trigger, understanding the micro-expressions that preceded the shot, recognizing the tells that separated good shooters from bad ones. 20 years of understanding that shooters, all shooters, regardless of skill level, always took the bait. His platoon mates at boot camp thought he was crazy, not dangerous crazy, not the kind of crazy that gets you Section 8'd out of the service. Carnival crazy, the guy who'd seen too many coin tosses and ring throws and couldn't stop analyzing human behavior like it was all one big midway game at Camp Pendleton, while everyone else obsessed over proper fieldcraft and fire discipline, while they practiced immediate action drills and studied the Marine Corps manual on small unit tactics. Eldridge kept muttering about trigger timing and visual commitment. He'd watch rifle practice and start analyzing the shooters like they were customers at his gallery, noting who compensated for recoil and who anticipated the shot. His squad leader finally told him to shut up about the carnival unless he wanted to peel potatoes until the war ended. The message was clear. Nobody cared about carnival psychology. This was the Marine Corps. This was serious. So Eldridge shut up. He kept his observations to himself, stopped trying to explain what he saw, and focused on becoming an adequate Marine. Not exceptional, just adequate enough to survive whatever was coming. He qualified as marksman with the M1 Garand, acceptable, but not impressive. He learned to dig a fighting hole and string barbed wire and read a map. He absorbed the lessons about fire and maneuver, about supporting arms, about all the doctrine that was about to prove inadequate against an enemy that fought differently than the manual assumed. Then came Bougainville. November 1943. Third day of the campaign. Eldridge's company was trying to advance down a trail that a Japanese sniper had turned into his personal hunting preserve, his private shooting gallery, where the prizes were American lives, 6 Marines down in 90 minutes. Nobody could spot the shooter. Nobody could even narrow down his position to within a 40-degree arc. Standard procedure said call for artillery, suppress the area with indirect fire, wait him out. Hope that tons of high explosive would accomplish what accurate rifle fire couldn't. But Eldridge was watching the bullet impacts, tracking the angles, doing the mental geometry that came naturally after 20 years of calculating where carnival customers were aiming, and suddenly he wasn't seeing a sniper anymore. He was seeing that kid from Omaha who used to come to the fair every year, the one who'd empty his pockets trying to knock down metal rabbits, who'd fire shot after shot at targets he knew were rigged but couldn't help engaging anyway. Same behavior, same psychology, same exploitable pattern. He told his lieutenant he had an idea. The lieutenant, a former accountant from Philadelphia who'd earned his commission at OCS and was utterly exhausted from 3 days of continuous combat, told him to get back in line. Eldridge persisted, said he needed a helmet, a stick, and 2 minutes. The lieutenant, exhausted and desperate and rapidly running out of Marines, gave him 30 seconds to explain before threatening him with insubordination charges that would see him busted down to private and assigned to the most miserable details available. What Eldridge said next sounded so ridiculous that 2 nearby riflemen started laughing, that nervous combat laughter that erupts when stress meets absurdity, sir. We make him waste his bullets shooting at nothing. Just like the shooting gallery back home, we wave a helmet, he shoots at it. We see where he shoots from, we kill him, simple. The lieutenant's response was immediate and profane, the kind of language that would have gotten him expelled from officer candidate school, but was perfectly acceptable when people were dying. You don't trick snipers. You suppress them with overwhelming firepower or outflank them with superior maneuver. This wasn't a carnival game, this was combat. And combat had rules, doctrine, procedures, written by people who actually understood warfare, not by some carnival worker who thought war was a midway attraction. Eldridge, to his considerable credit, didn't back down. He pointed out that they'd already fired 3,000 rounds at that sniper without effect, called in 2 mortar strikes that hit nothing but trees and wasted ammunition they couldn't spare, and lost 6 men doing things by the book. His way would cost 1 helmet and maybe some ammunition. The book's way was costing lives at a rate that would leave the company combat ineffective by sundown. What changed the lieutenant's mind wasn't Eldridge's logic or his carnival worker confidence. It was the wounded radio man they were carrying past on a stretcher, at that exact moment, 17 years old, shot through the jaw because he'd stood up for 2 seconds to adjust his antenna. The kid's face was destroyed, wrapped in bandages already soaking through with blood, and he was making sounds that weren't quite screams, but weren't anything human should make either. The lieutenant looked at that kid, looked at Eldridge, looked at the trail ahead, where the sniper was certainly waiting, and said 5 words that would echo through the rest of the Pacific War fine. Don't get yourself killed. Eldridge grabbed his helmet, the M1 steel pot that was supposed to protect his head from shrapnel, and was about to become a decoy, and found a sturdy branch about 5 feet long. He jammed the helmet onto one end, testing the fit, making sure it wouldn't slip. His squad thought they were watching a man commit elaborate suicide, devising the most convoluted method of getting himself killed in Marine Corps history. The other platoon, watching from 30 yards away, thought it was some kind of psychological breakdown that Eldridge had finally snapped under the pressure. The company commander, watching from 50 yards back with his binoculars, reached for them with the weary certainty that he was about to witness the stupidest death of the campaign and would need to document it in his after-action report. Nobody, not one single Marine on that trail, thought Eldridge's carnival trick would actually work. They thought he was going to die. They were already composing the story they'd tell when they got back to camp. Remember that carnival guy who thought he could trick a Jap sniper? Yeah, that went about how you'd expect. Eldridge knelt behind a fallen log, good solid cover that had already saved his life twice that morning. He extended the helmet-top stick about 3 feet above the cover and waved it slowly, deliberately, like a man moving carefully through underbrush. The movement pattern was crucial. Not too fast, not mechanical, natural, human. The way someone would actually move in hostile territory. The crack of the sniper's rifle came within 2 seconds. The helmet jerked violently as a 6.5mm round punched clean through the steel and exited the other side, and Marines who'd been preparing to write off Eldridge's stunt as terminal stupidity suddenly started paying very close attention. The sniper had taken the bait. He'd seen a helmet moving through vegetation and done exactly what his training demanded. Fire, engage, kill. The question was why, and more importantly, whether he'd do it again. Japanese sniper training at the Nakano School emphasized immediate target engagement based on a principle their instructors called Ichi Hatsu, one opportunity, one shot. The doctrine wasn't primarily about conserving ammunition, though that was important. It was about maintaining psychological dominance over the battlefield. A sniper who saw an enemy helmet moving through vegetation and didn't fire was allowing that enemy to advance, to establish position, potentially to spot the sniper's location. The manual captured later at Saipan and translated by bilingual Nisei Marines was explicit in its instructions. Delay equals detection equals death. When you see the target, you shoot. Hesitation wasn't tactical patience. It was failure. It was violating the fundamental principle of sniper operations, that doctrinal reflex combined with something nobody at Nakano School had accounted for, something they couldn't have predicted because it required an understanding of human neurology that didn't exist in 1943. The human visual system's inability to distinguish real from fake targets at combat distances under stress. When a helmet appears above cover moving at roughly 2 miles per hour, the speed of a careful combat advance, the brain processes it through a cascade of automatic responses: threat, helmet, marine, shoot. The entire sequence takes approximately 0.6 seconds, the time required for visual information to travel from the eye through the occipital lobe to the motor cortex and down to the trigger finger. 0.6 seconds where the conscious mind isn't really involved at all, where higher reasoning is bypassed entirely. Pure trained reflex, pure stimulus response. But here's where Eldridge's carnival experience gave him an edge. That Marine Corps doctrine hadn't considered, couldn't have considered, because no military theorist had spent 20 years running a shooting gallery. At the fair, he'd watched thousands of people shoot at mechanical ducks moving on tracks. The good shooters hit maybe 70%. The bad ones hit 30% on a generous day. But everyone, and he meant everyone, took multiple shots, even when they knew, intellectually understood, that the ducks were fake. It wasn't about being fooled by some clever deception. It was about the neurological commitment. Once your brain said target and your finger started pulling the trigger, stopping that sequence required conscious override. And conscious thought was always slower than reflex. The mind could know the truth while the body followed its training. Eldridge waved the helmet again. Different angle this time, different height, the way a man might move after pausing to check his surroundings. Another crack, another hole. The steel pot now had 2 perfectly placed entry wounds. The sniper was committed now, locked into a behavioral loop that his training had hardwired into his nervous system over hundreds of hours of practice. Target visible equals fire weapon. It was automatic, inevitable. Each shot took roughly 4 seconds to cycle, work the bolt, extract the spent casing chamber, a new round, acquire sight picture, control breathing, squeeze trigger. 4 seconds where the sniper's conscious mind could theoretically intervene and say, wait, this might be a decoy. But 4 seconds wasn't enough time to overcome training that had been drilled to the point of automaticity. The motion looked right. The silhouette looked right. The speed looked right. And that doctrinal imperative, shoot or allow enemy advance, overrode skepticism every single time. Better to waste 1 round on a decoy than let a real Marine advance 3 feet closer. Corporal James Henshaw, a Marine marksman from rural Montana who'd grown up shooting coyotes at 300 yards, was counting the shots and tracking the muzzle flashes. By the 3rd shot, he had the sniper triangulated to within a 10-foot radius. 40 feet up in a coconut palm about 80 yards northeast, hidden in a cluster of fronds that provided perfect concealment. The 4th shot confirmed it, a tiny flash, barely visible even to someone who knew what to look for. But there, present, real. Henshaw settled his Springfield .03 rifle, the legendary Marine sniper weapon that had served since World War I. He controlled his breathing exactly the way he'd been trained at Quantico, exactly the way his grandfather had taught him on the Montana plains. Slow exhale, natural pause, squeeze. He sent 170 grains of copper-jacketed lead through the space where that flash had originated, through 80 yards of humid air, through the fronds, and into the Japanese sniper who'd made the fatal mistake of shooting at a carnival trick. The subsequent silence lasted about 10 seconds before someone started laughing. Then everyone was laughing, that slightly hysterical combat laughter that erupts when you realize something impossibly stupid just worked, when the universe violates your expectations in a way that leaves you alive. Eldridge lowered his stick, examined the helmet with its 2 neat holes, and said the most Eldridge thing possible, the sentence that would be repeated in every officers' club in the Pacific Theater within a month. Told you. Just like the ducks at the fair. Word travels fast in a combat zone, especially when that word involves not dying. Within 48 hours, every rifle company in the 3rd Marine Division had heard about the Nebraska Carnival sergeant who'd turned sniper hunting into a puppet show. Some officers dismissed it as lucky fluke, a one-time success that wouldn't replicate under different conditions. Others wanted to see it for themselves, wanted to verify that this absurdity actually worked. The company commander, a captain from Virginia who'd lost 11 men to snipers in 2 weeks and was approaching his breaking point, decided Eldridge was going to give a demonstration whether he wanted to or not. The opportunity came at Tarawa in November 1943, during what would become the bloodiest 76 hours of the Pacific War to that point. The Marines hit the beaches on November 20th, expecting heavy resistance at the water's edge, expecting to fight for every yard of coral. What they got was that, plus something worse. Japanese snipers who'd survived the naval bombardment, who'd hidden in reinforced positions while American battleships threw tons of steel at the island, and who were now methodically picking off anyone who thought they'd secured an area. The 2nd Marine Division's casualty reports from day one showed 38 confirmed sniper kills, a number that made conventional counter-sniper operations look completely inadequate, almost laughably insufficient. Eldridge's squad got tasked with clearing a Japanese strongpoint on day 2, a cluster of damaged bunkers where at least 3 snipers had established interlocking fields of fire. It was a nightmare position, the kind of defensive setup that made assault planners weep. Standard assault doctrine would have meant calling in air support, probably losing a dozen Marines in the approach, and hoping you caught the snipers in the blast radius before they killed everyone exposed during the advance. Instead, their platoon leader, now a true believer, after Bougainville, gave Eldridge the green light to try his carnival routine with proper support. They set up 4 helmet stations at different points around the strongpoint, each one manned by a Marine with a stick and the absolute, possibly insane faith that he was about to become a bullet magnet. The plan was coordinated, almost choreographed. Wave the helmets in sequence, create multiple targets, force the snipers to reveal themselves through muzzle, flash, and impact patterns. Behind each helmet operator, a Marine sniper with an 03 Springfield and a unilateral scope waited for something to shoot at that wasn't a decoy. The operation started at 08:30 hours and turned into a masterclass in behavioral exploitation, a demonstration that would be studied in staff colleges for decades. First helmet goes up. Crack. Bullet. Flash spotted. Second helmet. Crack. Different angle, different shooter. Second sniper identified. Third helmet. Crack. Third sniper confirmed. The Japanese marksmen couldn't help themselves, couldn't override the training that demanded immediate engagement. Their training, their doctrine, their entire tactical framework demanded they engage visible targets immediately. 4 Marines waving helmets on sticks had just turned 3 lethal snipers into predictable stimulus response machines, had reduced trained warriors to laboratory rats pressing levers. Over the next 2 hours, those 4 helmets drew 47 separate shots from the Japanese positions. 47 times a sniper saw what looked like a Marine head moving through the battlefield. 47 times he pulled his trigger, followed his training, did everything right according to his manual. And 47 times he accomplished nothing except revealing his location to Marines who were very, very good at shooting back. The Marine counter-snipers kept careful count, documented everything for the after-action report. First sniper eliminated at 08:45 hours, second at 09:20, third at 09:53. Then things got interesting, got weird in a way nobody had anticipated, because the helmet trick had attracted snipers from adjacent positions. They'd heard the firing, heard what sounded like a target-rich environment, and moved closer to participate. By 10:30 hours, Marine marksmen had confirmed 11 Japanese snipers killed, all drawn in by the decoys like moths to a flame, all eliminated by shooters who'd never have spotted them without the helmet trick, forcing them to give away their positions, the cost to the Marines. 4 helmets with multiple holes, some sore arms from holding sticks for 2 hours, and 0 casualties. 0. In an operation that conventional doctrine suggested would cost at least 8 to 10 killed, and twice that wounded, Eldridge's carnival game had achieved complete tactical success without losing a single Marine. Not one. The battalion commander showed up personally to watch the last hour. He didn't say much, just stood there with his arms crossed, smoking cigarette after cigarette, watching helmets bob on sticks while his snipers dropped Japanese marksmen one by one. When it was over, when the firing had stopped and the battlefield had gone silent, he looked at Eldridge and asked one question. Can you teach this? Eldridge could teach it, but what he really taught the Marine Corps, what the ramifications of his carnival trick revealed, was something Japanese logistics officers had been quietly worrying about since Guadalcanal ammunition arithmetic. The brutal mathematics of island warfare. Every Japanese sniper deployed to the Pacific carried 120 rounds in 6 stripper clips of 20 rounds each. That sounds like plenty until you realize it had to last for the entire duration of their deployment, which on fortified islands meant weeks or even months with zero resupply. Their supply doctrine assumed 15 rounds expended per day maximum, which meant an 8-day supply if they were disciplined, if they took only high-probability shots. The helmet trick could burn through 50 rounds in an afternoon, 50 rounds shooting at nothing, at empty steel pots waved by carnival workers who understood human psychology better than military theorists did. Marine intelligence first documented the ammunition constraint in January 1944 when they overran a sniper position on New Britain and found a dead Japanese marksman with only 7 rounds remaining. But more importantly, they found a handwritten note tucked into his ammunition pouch. A captured Korean laborer pressed into service by the Japanese and more than willing to help his captors, translated it. The note read, 17 days no resupply, conserve ammunition or die useless. And that note made its way up to division intelligence, got passed from captain to major to colonel, and suddenly people started doing math that should have been obvious from the beginning. Japanese logistics in the Pacific were terrible, were catastrophically inadequate. Their supply lines were getting shredded by American submarines. Island garrisons were isolated, surrounded, cut off from resupply. A sniper who wasted 47 rounds shooting at decoys wasn't just ineffective, he was operationally finished. He'd transformed from force multiplier to irrelevant spectator. The numbers told a brutal story. If a Japanese sniper started his deployment with 120 rounds and the Marines ran 4 helmet decoys for 2 hours, conservatively drawing 12 shots per decoy, that's 48 rounds expended. 40% of his total ammunition gone in one morning shooting at helmets mounted on sticks. Now he's got 72 rounds left, but he's already catastrophically behind the resupply curve because his commanders assumed he'd only use 30 rounds in 2 days, not lose 48 in 2 hours, and there's no resupply coming. The submarines have seen to that. The I-boats that were supposed to run supplies to isolated garrisons are on the bottom of the Pacific. What happened next was a psychological transformation that Marine forward observers started noticing by February 1944. Japanese snipers were becoming hesitant, not smart, hesitant, not the tactical patience of waiting for high-value targets, panicked, hesitant, paralyzed, hesitant. They couldn't pull the trigger even on legitimate targets because they were terrified of running out of ammunition, because they'd been tricked into wasting so many rounds that every remaining shot felt precious beyond measure. Marines advancing through areas that should have been sniper country, terrain that screamed ambush, started reporting enemy marksmen letting obvious targets pass. One patrol on NOM-4 reported a Japanese sniper who'd let 7 Marines walk directly past his position before finally shooting at the 8th, missing and immediately displacing a complete violation of every principle in his training manual. Bad tactical judgment driven by ammunition scarcity driven by carnival tricks. Captured Japanese after-action reports, the few that existed from units not completely annihilated, confirmed what the Marines were seeing. One document from Kwajalein described, sniper squads rendered combat ineffective, by enemy deception tactics requiring excessive ammunition expenditure. Another from Saipan reported snipers abandoning positions after expending 70 rounds with negligible enemy casualties achieved. These weren't combat losses, these weren't positions overrun by marine assaults, these were snipers still alive, still in position, but functionally useless because they'd been tricked into emptying their pouches, shooting at nothing. The helmet trick had weaponized scarcity, had turned Japanese logistics problems into tactical victories. Japanese doctrine assumed their snipers were shooting at real targets, achieving real kills, justifying every round expended. But when 40% of those rounds punched through empty helmets, the entire tactical framework collapsed. A sniper with 20 rounds left wasn't a threat multiplier anymore. He was a regular rifleman who happened to be stuck in a tree with no way to meaningfully affect the battle. He'd gone from hunter to witness, watching Marines advance, while he conserved his last magazine for some desperate final stand that probably wouldn't matter anyway, that would end with him dying alone in a tree while the battle moved past his position. Marine casualty reports started reflecting the shift in concrete numbers that couldn't be argued with. Confirmed sniper kills per battalion dropped from averages of 12 per day in late 1943 to 7 per day by April 1944 in comparable island assaults. The Japanese snipers hadn't gotten worse at shooting. Their marksmanship was as good as ever when they pulled the trigger. They'd just been systematically starved of ammunition through a carnival trick that cost the Marines nothing but helmets, through behavioral exploitation that no staff college would have predicted. The Marine Corps doesn't usually adopt tactics invented by carnival workers, especially when those tactics sound like something a desperate platoon made up 5 minutes before getting overrun. Military institutions run on doctrine, on field manuals, on training procedures developed by people with academy credentials and staff college diplomas. But by January 1944, the casualty numbers from the Pacific were forcing some uncomfortable admissions at headquarters. Traditional counter-sniper operations weren't working. Eldridge's helmet trick was. Sometimes the numbers don't care about your credentials. The formal standardization process started in February 1944 at Camp Pendleton, where Marine Corps schools convened a working group on counter-sniper tactics. They brought in Eldridge, now sporting a Bronze Star he thought was ridiculous, and asked him to demonstrate his technique to a room full of skeptical officers who'd spent their entire careers studying warfare through the lens of established military theory. What they saw was a Nebraska sergeant waving a helmet on a stick while explaining sight picture acquisition and trigger psychology using carnival terminology that wasn't in any field manual, that sounded almost comically inappropriate in a military context. He talked about taking the bait and sucker shots and the commitment problem. Half the room thought it was embarrassing, thought it degraded the profession of arms. The other half thought it might save lives. That was the divide, dignity versus effectiveness. The compromise was typical military bureaucracy, the kind of solution that preserves everyone's face while adopting what works. They'd adopt the tactic, but dress it up in proper doctrinal language. The official training manual released in March 1944 called it Decoy Initiated Counter-Sniper Protocol instead of Eldridge's helmet trick. The equipment list specified expendable helmet mounted on portable extension device instead of helmet on a stick. But the actual content was pure carnival logic, translated into military speak. Present realistic target silhouette, employ irregular movement patterns, maintain operator concealment. All of which meant wave the helmet, don't stand where the helmet is, and try not to look stupid while doing it. What made the doctrine actually effective wasn't the manual. It was the refinements that came from Marines who took Eldridge's basic concept and started experimenting, started pushing the boundaries. A corporal from Iowa added weight to the helmet interior so it bobbed more naturally when moved, gave it inertia that mimicked human motion. A private from Texas discovered that dragging the helmet slowly across an opening drew more shots than waving it. That horizontal movement triggered the engagement reflex more reliably. A sergeant from Louisiana figured out that if you paused the helmet for 3 seconds, then moved it suddenly, snipers would fire reflexively at the motion, would shoot before their conscious mind could intervene. Within 2 months, rifle companies across the Pacific were developing their own variations, each one exploiting some aspect of human visual response and trigger psychology. The helmet trick evolved, became sophisticated, became something that looked almost scientific when you watched trained Marines execute it. The training program became surprisingly rigorous. By April 1944, every Marine rifle company in the Pacific Theater received a 2-hour block of instruction on helmet decoy operations. They practiced on bamboo poles cut to precise 5-foot lengths, short enough to control with one hand, long enough to keep your head well away from the helmet. They learned choreographed movement patterns that had been tested under fire and refined based on what drew the most shots. Slow wave, pause, quick bob, diagonal sweep. The instructors, many of them combat veterans, who'd seen the technique work and save lives, taught timing and rhythm like they were teaching dance steps move too predictably, and smart snipers might catch on. Move too erratically and you don't trigger their engagement reflex. The sweet spot was human natural, the irregular rhythm of a real Marine moving carefully through hostile terrain. Some units added theatrical elements that would have made Eldridge proud, that showed they'd internalized the carnival psychology. They put lieutenant bars on some helmets to make them priority targets, banking on Japanese doctrine that emphasized killing officers. They attached fabric strips to simulate camouflage covers fluttering in wind. One creative company on Peleliu started adding fake radio antennas made from bent wire, banking on Japanese intelligence doctrine that prioritized killing communications personnel. The Japanese kept shooting, the Marines kept counting, and the body count kept shifting in the right direction. By June 1944, what had started as one sergeant's ridiculous idea had become standard operating procedure across the entire Marine Corps Pacific Command. The official after-action reviews were careful to credit systematic doctrinal development. Rather than a carnival worker from Nebraska, but every Marine who'd actually done it, who'd waved that helmet and heard the crack of incoming fire, knew the truth. The real test of any tactic isn't whether it works once under ideal conditions. It's whether it scales across different terrain, different enemy units, different tactical situations. The helmet trick got that test across every major island campaign from early 1944 through the end of the war. And the data that emerged told a story that even the most skeptical staff officers at headquarters couldn't dismiss. Between Tarawa in November 1943 and Iwo Jima in February 1945, Marine casualties attributed to sniper fire dropped by 38% despite fighting in terrain that should have made sniping more effective, not less. The statistics were stark and undeniable. At Tarawa, the 2nd Marine Division recorded 114 confirmed sniper casualties over 76 hours, roughly 1.5 Marines killed or wounded per hour of combat operations. At Saipan in June 1944, 7 months after helmet decoy doctrine became standard, the same division in comparable jungle terrain recorded 68 sniper casualties over 3 weeks. The raw numbers looked similar until you factored in operational tempo. Saipan involved 15 times more combat hours, meaning the per-hour sniper casualty rate had dropped to 0.04. Same division, same enemy, completely different outcome. Peleliu in September 1944 provided even more compelling evidence because the terrain was sniper paradise, the kind of ground that made every tactical officer's nightmare look optimistic. Coral ridges with countless caves, elevation advantages, firing positions that could cover multiple approaches. Japanese commanders had spent months during their defensive preparation specifically selecting sniper positions, creating interlocking fields of fire that should have made Marine advances catastrophically expensive. Instead, 1st Marine Division after-action reports documented a pattern that kept repeating with mathematical regularity: helmet decoys deployed. Japanese snipers engaged, counter-snipers eliminated threats, advances continued with minimal casualties. One rifle company logged 43 separate helmet decoy operations over 8 days, drew an estimated 300 Japanese shots, and suffered only 2 sniper casualties during that entire period. 2 casualties from what should have been dozens. The Japanese knew what was happening to them. They weren't stupid. Captured documents from Saipan included a tactical memorandum dated July 2nd, 1944, from a Japanese infantry colonel to his remaining sniper teams. A Marine translator working for Division Intelligence flagged it as significant, forwarded it up the chain with a note saying, "They've figured it out." The memo read, "Enemy employs false targets to waste ammunition and reveal positions. Sniper teams must exercise fire discipline and verify targets before engagement." It then listed specific recognition factors that showed someone had been thinking hard about the problem. Check for neck shadow. Verify arm movement. Confirm natural gait patterns. Look for the small details that separated real Marines from helmets on sticks. It was a desperate attempt to counter-program the reflexive target engagement that Japanese doctrine had spent years drilling into their snipers, to override training that had been hammered into muscle memory through thousands of repetitions. The problem was that conscious verification takes time, precious seconds that combat doesn't allow, and time in combat gets you killed. A sniper who paused 3 seconds to verify whether that helmet was real or fake was a sniper who let actual Marines advance 3 seconds closer to his position, who allowed the enemy to close the distance that was his only protection. Japanese field commanders were trapped between 2 bad options, caught in a dilemma the Marines had deliberately created: shoot reflexively and waste ammunition on decoys, or hesitate and allow enemy advances. The Marines had weaponized that dilemma, and there wasn't a good doctrinal answer. Both options led to defeat. By Iwo Jima in February 1945, captured Japanese position maps told the final story in stark visual terms. Marine intelligence recovered planning documents from a destroyed command bunker that showed sniper positions color-coded by ammunition status. Red positions indicated critical ammunition shortage. The map had 43 sniper positions marked across the island. 37 of them were red. The annotations, translated by bilingual Nisei Marines, repeatedly referenced enemy deception and excessive ammunition consumption and resupply impossible. One note read simply, "Position effectiveness degraded." These weren't positions that had been overrun or destroyed by direct assault. These were positions still occupied by living Japanese snipers who'd been reduced to tactical irrelevance because they'd shot at too many helmets, because a carnival worker from Nebraska had figured out how to turn their training against them. The cumulative strategic impact was impossible to quantify precisely, but division medical officers made educated estimates based on casualty trends. If sniper casualty rates had remained at Tarawa levels through Iwo Jima, the Marine Corps would have suffered an additional 4,000 sniper-related casualties across the island campaigns, 4,000 Marines who came home instead of dying to an invisible enemy, 4,000 families who got their sons and brothers back. All because one carnival worker understood that shooters always take the bait, always follow their training, even when their training leads them to destruction. Sergeant William Eldridge made it through Okinawa in spring 1945, which statistically shouldn't have happened. The odds were against him in ways that made actuaries weep. The 10th Army suffered over 65,000 casualties during 82 days of fighting, making it the bloodiest campaign of the Pacific War. The nightmare that wouldn't end Eldridge's company took 68% casualties, which meant he watched most of the men he'd trained with, fought alongside, shared foxholes with, get killed or evacuated with wounds that would mark them forever. He spent those final months of combat doing the same thing he'd been doing since Bougainville, waving helmets on sticks, teaching new replacements the carnival tricks, trying to compress years of observation into hours of instruction, trying not to think about how something that seemed so obvious to him had somehow become revolutionary military doctrine, had saved thousands of lives through pure common sense. When the war ended in August 1945, after the atomic bombs fell and the Emperor's voice crackled over Japanese radios for the first time in history, Eldridge was a staff sergeant with decorations he didn't much care about, a Bronze Star for that first helmet trick on Bougainville, 2 Purple Hearts from wounds he barely remembered getting, fragments of metal that had torn through his body during firefights that blurred together into one continuous nightmare. A service record that mentioned, in typically understated military language, his innovative tactical contributions to counter-sniper operations. It didn't mention the lives saved, didn't mention that his carnival psychology had rewritten Marine Corps doctrine, didn't mention that staff officers at Quantico were already incorporating his techniques into the official manual under proper military terminology. He got processed out at Camp Pendleton in October, received his discharge papers stamped with official seals, and took a Greyhound bus back to Lincoln, Nebraska. His father picked him up at the station, and they drove through streets that looked exactly the same as when he'd left, as if the world hadn't changed, as if he hadn't spent 3 years in hell. His father asked how the war was. Eldridge said what almost every combat veteran says, what they all say when the truth is too complicated to explain. Fine, it was fine. Let's talk about something else. The shooting gallery was still there on the fairgrounds, hadn't changed a bit. Same mechanical ducks running on the same tracks, same bell that rang when you hit the target, same badly calibrated rifles that made perfect shots miss by design. Eldridge stepped back into running it like he'd never left, like there hadn't been a war, like he hadn't used his carnival knowledge to save thousands of lives. Except now he had this weird habit of watching people's trigger discipline and muttering about sight picture acquisition. Customers thought he'd gotten particularly obsessive about his carnival game, thought maybe the war had made him a bit odd. They had no idea. He'd actually spent 3 years watching the same behavioral patterns get men killed or keep them alive, depending on which side understood them better. The Bronze Star citation arrived by mail in November 1945, forwarded from Marine Corps headquarters in Washington. Official letterhead, proper formatting, the bureaucratic language of military awards. It credited him with exceptional ingenuity in developing counter-sniper techniques that significantly reduce casualties across multiple campaigns. Eldridge read it once, read those sanitized words that turned horror and death into bureaucratic achievement, put it in a drawer, and never brought it up unless someone directly asked. And even then, he downplayed it. When people did ask, usually other veterans who recognized the ribbon when he wore it to VFW meetings, his explanation was always the same. Consistent, modest, just seemed like common sense. Shooters shoot at targets. We gave them fake targets, not exactly rocket science, but it was rocket science, or at least behavioral science, neurology, and tactical psychology wrapped up in carnival intuition that no academic could have predicted. Eldridge never framed it that way because he'd learned everything by watching thousands of people try to win stuffed animals at the Nebraska State Fair. He didn't know the academic terms for visual stimulus response or doctrinal behavioral conditioning. He'd never read a psychology textbook. He just knew that people, Japanese snipers included, couldn't help shooting at things that looked like things they were supposed to shoot at. And once you understood that fundamental truth about human nature, the rest was just execution. The Marine Corps kept using helmet decoy tactics through Korea in the early 1950s and into Vietnam in the 1960s, with modifications for different terrain and enemy doctrine. The basic principles stayed the same because human psychology stayed the same: exploit the opponent's training and reflexes against them, use cheap decoys that cost nothing and saved lives, force the enemy to reveal himself through the very tactics he'd been trained to use. Various field manuals over the decades credited the technique to systematic doctrinal development in the Pacific theater, without mentioning that it came from a carnival worker who thought the whole thing was obvious, who couldn't understand why military professionals hadn't figured it out themselves. Eldridge ran the shooting gallery until he died in 1987 at age 71, a heart attack that took him quickly while he was restocking the prizes. His obituary in the Lincoln Journal-Star mentioned his Marine Corps service in one sentence, a brief acknowledgement that he'd served in the Pacific. Then it spent 3 paragraphs talking about how he'd been a fixture at the State Fair for 50 years, how generations of Lincoln families had memories of trying to win prizes at his gallery, how he'd become part of the city's cultural fabric. Nobody mentioned that his carnival trick had saved thousands of lives. Nobody mentioned that he'd turned Japanese sniper doctrine inside out using principles he'd learned watching people shoot at mechanical ducks. Nobody connected the shooting gallery operator with the sergeant who'd changed Marine Corps tactics. He probably would have preferred it that way. Eldridge wasn't looking for glory or recognition. He'd seen too much death to romanticize warfare, had watched too many good men die to think of combat as anything but necessary horror. Common sense doesn't need monuments. It doesn't need plaques or historical markers. It just needs to work. And his carnival trick had worked beyond anyone's wildest expectations, had saved lives through understanding something fundamental about human behavior that all the military theory in the world had missed. The helmet trick became one of those innovations that seems obvious only in retrospect, only after someone demonstrates it and you wonder why no one thought of it. Before, military historians studying the Pacific War eventually recognized it as a brilliant example of asymmetric tactical innovation, of bottom-up problem-solving that outperformed top-down doctrine. Staff colleges began using it as a case study in creative thinking, in being willing to accept solutions from unexpected sources, but they taught it without the carnival context, without understanding that Eldridge's entire life had been preparation for that moment on Bougainville when he looked at a sniper problem and saw a shooting gallery customer. The Japanese military, in their own post-war analysis, identified the helmet decoy as one of several American innovations that had fundamentally disrupted their tactical planning. They trained their snipers to shoot at visible targets immediately, had built an entire doctrine around immediate engagement, and the Americans had turned that doctrine into a liability. The captured documents show Japanese officers struggling to understand how their well-trained snipers had been reduced to shooting at empty helmets, how behavioral exploitation had succeeded where overwhelming firepower had failed. What they never fully grasped was that the innovation hadn't come from military professionals or tactical theorists. It had come from a man who understood human psychology through 20 years of watching people try to win stuffed animals, who understood that training creates patterns and patterns can be exploited. The Japanese had trained their snipers too well, had made immediate engagement so automatic that conscious thought couldn't override it fast enough. And Eldridge had recognized that vulnerability because he'd spent his life exploiting similar vulnerabilities in carnival customers. The true genius of the helmet trick wasn't in its complexity. It was in its simplicity. No advanced technology required, no special equipment beyond a stick and a helmet, no extensive training beyond understanding basic human psychology. Any Marine could do it once they understood the principle. That scalability, that democratic accessibility, was what made it revolutionary. It wasn't a technique that required elite snipers or special operations training. It was common sense made tactical, carnival psychology applied to warfare. The lives saved can't be counted with precision. The statistics show a 38% reduction in sniper casualties after the technique became standard. But that's just the documented cases. How many Marines lived because a Japanese sniper was out of ammunition when they crossed his field of fire? How many survived because a sniper hesitated, paralyzed by ammunition scarcity when he should have shot? How many made it home because Eldridge understood that shooters always take the bait? The answer is thousands, possibly tens of thousands. When you account for all the downstream effects, every Marine who didn't die to a sniper went on to fight more battles, to contribute to more victories. Every Marine who survived brought his experience and skills to subsequent campaigns, made his unit more effective, helped other Marines survive. The ripple effects extended far beyond simple casualty numbers. Morale improved when Marines realized they weren't helpless against snipers, when they had a technique that worked. Tactical tempo increased when advances didn't have to halt for extended counter-sniper operations. Strategic planning became more aggressive when commanders could factor in reduced sniper casualties. But perhaps the most significant impact was psychological. The helmet trick gave Marines agency against an enemy that had seemed invincible, unstoppable. Japanese snipers had generated a level of fear disproportionate to their actual numbers because they represented an enemy you couldn't see, couldn't fight, couldn't defeat through courage or firepower. The helmet trick changed that calculus. Suddenly snipers were manageable, predictable, exploitable. That psychological shift mattered more than any casualty statistics could capture. The Marine Corps, to its credit, eventually recognized Eldridge's contribution officially. In 1983, 2 years before his death, the Marine Corps Historical Division interviewed him for their oral history project. The interviewer, a young captain with a degree in military history, asked about the helmet trick's development. Eldridge's response, preserved in the archives at Quantico, captured his lifelong perspective. "I just did what made sense. Been watching people shoot at fake ducks my whole life. Knew they couldn't help themselves. Jap snipers were the same way. Good training makes you automatic. Automatic means predictable. Predictable means exploitable. Wasn't genius, was just paying attention." That interview transcript, buried in the archives, reveals something the official histories Miss Eldridge understood human behavior at a level that exceeded formal military training because he'd spent his life observing it without the filters of doctrine or theory. He'd watched pure stimulus response thousands of times, had internalized patterns that military psychologists were only beginning to study formally. His carnival background wasn't a disadvantage overcome. It was the exact preparation needed for the problem he encountered. The Marine Corps made the helmet trick. Eldridge received official recognition, but the technique itself became immortal in a different way. It entered the informal tactical culture. The knowledge passed from veteran to replacement, from one generation of Marines to the next. Sergeants taught it to privates. Officers mentioned it in their lessons on tactical innovation. It became part of the institutional memory, stripped of Eldridge's name but carrying his insight. Understand your enemy's training, understand human psychology, and you can turn strength into weakness. In Korea, Marines used variations of the helmet trick against Chinese and North Korean snipers. The principles remained valid even as the enemy changed in Vietnam. The technique evolved again, adapted to jungle warfare against Viet Cong, who employed their own sniper tactics. Each generation of Marines rediscovered the fundamental truth Eldridge had understood: shooters shoot at targets. Give them fake targets and they'll shoot themselves into irrelevance. Modern military training still teaches versions of the helmet decoy, now dressed in terminology about signature management and deceptive targeting. The principle remains unchanged: force the enemy to reveal himself through his own training and doctrine. The technology has evolved. Thermal imaging and drone surveillance would have amazed Eldridge, but the psychology hasn't. Human beings still respond to training automatically. Trained reflexes still override conscious thought. A sniper who sees a target-shaped object moving at target speed still has to fight against years of conditioning that says, "Shoot now." Eldridge died without knowing how far his innovation had reached, how many lives it had saved across decades of conflict. He died thinking he'd done something obvious, something any sensible person would have figured out. That misunderstanding of his own contribution was perhaps his most endearing quality. He never grasped that obvious solutions are only obvious after someone demonstrates them, that common sense applied to complex problems is the rarest form of genius. The shooting gallery at the Nebraska State Fair still operates, though under different management now. The mechanical ducks still run on tracks, people still try to win prizes. But a small plaque near the entrance mentions that this gallery was operated by Staff Sergeant William Eldridge, USMC, whose carnival experience led to innovations that saved thousands of lives during World War II. Most visitors ignore the plaque, focused on the game. But occasionally a veteran stops to read it, recognizes the name from some half-remembered story, and understands that this humble carnival game was the training ground for a technique that changed military history. The Japanese snipers who wasted hundreds of rounds shooting at Eldridge's helmets never knew they were being exploited by carnival psychology. They died or survived the war, thinking they'd fought honorably, had followed their training, had done everything their doctrine demanded. They never understood that their training, their discipline, their adherence to proper procedure had been weaponized against them by a man who'd spent his life watching people shoot at fake ducks. That's the final irony of Eldridge's story. The Japanese had invested enormous resources in sniper training, had developed sophisticated doctrine, had created what they believed was the ultimate jungle warfare technique. And it was defeated by carnival psychology, by insights gained from watching Americans try to win stuffed animals at county fairs. The most advanced military training of its era was countered by the most humble, civilian experience, imaginable common sense, defeated doctrine. Observation trumped theory. And a carnival worker from Nebraska saved thousands of lives by understanding one simple truth. People can't help shooting at things that look like targets. Sometimes the most profound military innovations come not from academies or staff colleges, but from unexpected places where someone has been paying attention to human nature long enough to understand its patterns. Sergeant William Eldridge never thought of himself as a military innovator or tactical genius. He was just a guy who ran a shooting gallery and happened to notice that people always took the bait. That modest self-assessment was completely accurate and profoundly wrong. He was exactly what he thought he was. And he was also the man who changed Marine Corps counter-sniper doctrine forever, who saved thousands of lives, who proved that sometimes the best military minds are the ones that never went to military schools. The helmet trick remains his legacy, though few remember his name. Every Marine who used it, who waved that helmet and watched enemy snipers waste their ammunition, was benefiting from Eldridge's carnival wisdom. Every life saved, every advance made possible, every victory won because snipers couldn't stop the assault, owed something to a Nebraska sergeant who understood that trained reflexes can't distinguish real from fake when both look exactly like what you're trained to shoot. In the end, that's what matters. Not the recognition or the historical footnotes, but the lives saved, the Marines who came home, the families who weren't destroyed by grief. Eldridge would have said that was just common sense, that saving lives when you can is the only thing that matters. And he would have been right, just as he was right about the helmet trick, right in the way that simple truths are always right when you finally see them clearly. Common sense doesn't need monuments, it just needs to work. And Sergeant William Eldridge's carnival trick worked better than anyone could have imagined, saved more lives than any citation could capture, and proved that sometimes the most valuable military training happens at county fairs, where mechanical ducks run on tracks and carnival workers watch human nature reveal itself one shot at a time.